Whether be it on TikTok, on YouTube, in school, or in academia, you have no doubt come across the claim that the medieval Islamic invaders who colonized Spain in the 8th century were beacons of tolerance and philosophy, who enlightened the backwards native Christian Europeans while treating them as equals in an almost utopian society located in southern Spain from the year 711 until 1491, when the Islamic paradise in Spain was destroyed by the intolerant Spanish Christians who dared to reconquer their homeland. This narrative, however, is false and exclusively pushed by political factions and countries who benefit from spreading this belief, like, for example, Islamists in Europe and other people who wish to portray Europeans as the absolute worst. But nonetheless, these forces have been incredibly successful in convincing many people of this myth, like, for example, Tony Blair, who in 2007 stated the standard bearers of tolerance in the early medieval ages were far more likely to be found in Muslim lands than in Christian ones. And it's exactly because of how widespread this politically convenient misconception is that this video that aims to tell the truth about how horrific life was as a Christian in Muslim Spain is so important. So share it wherever you can. Let's begin from, well, the beginning by talking about how the Muslims took control over such large parts of Spain in the first place. Did the Muslims merely send out missionaries to the Spanish peasants living in the Dark Ages who quickly adopted the Islamic creed because of its obvious superiority? No, that didn't happen. Just like how Islam had spread from the Arabian Peninsula through the Middle East by conquering and subjugating its indigenous Christian population groups with the goal of expanding their own empire, the Muslims, under the leadership of the Umayyad Caliphate, militarily invaded Spain and Portugal, whose population, according to the historian Ibn Abd al-Hakam, was in no way expecting an attack, and in fact at first believed that the invading ships coming from North Africa were trade vessels. After having conquered the important southern Spanish city of Córdoba, the Islamic invaders beheaded all the defenders, and all the churches were immediately destroyed by the invading jihadists or converted into mosques. The city was thereafter handed over to the Jewish minority, who then served as the city's administrators on the behalf of the Muslims. The Muslim control over Spain and Portugal at its height right after the invasion stretched from the southern coast of Spain all the way until the mountainous region of Asturias on the northern coast of Spain. It was in this rural region in around the year 720 that the Muslim invaders were finally defeated in the Battle of Covadonga, where 300 Europeans vanquished the invaders, with folkloric stories telling that only 10 Europeans were left standing victorious at the end. But despite this defeat, the vast majority of Spain and Portugal was still under Muslim control. Al-Andalus was the name given to the areas of Spain under Muslim control. And how did life change here for the native Christians who now lived in this colonial state under Sharia law? Was it the exciting and tolerant multicultural paradise that, for example, The Economist called it in 2001? Well, it under no circumstances was. You see, in Al-Andalus, the discrimination that the Spanish Christians suffered was systematic and codified, thanks to Sharia law. An integral part of Al-Andalus's Islamic governance was Sharia law, meaning God's law, and in accordance to Sharia, all non-Muslims living in an Islamic state are forced to convert to Islam, except for so-called people of the book, which are Zoroastrians, Jews, and Christians. But while these groups were not legally forced to convert to Islam, they were, however, heavily discriminated against through the so-called Dhimmi system. The Islamic Dhimmi system that was practiced in the Islamic paradise of Muslim Spain demanded that the European Christians had to pay protection money called Jizya to the Muslim colonizers in a mafia-style extortion scheme where the choices were either paying the Jizya or death. And while contemporary academics that have made a living out of glorifying the Islamic invasions of Europe claim that this system was merely the Christian version of the normal tax imposed upon Muslims, this is completely incorrect, since Islamic law scholars describes the difference between the normal tax Muslims have to pay and the Christian jizya like this. The tax that Muslims pay is meant to purify them and shall be given to poor Muslims. The jizya tax that Christians and Jews pay, on the other hand, is meant to humble them. The jizya that the Spanish Christians had to pay to the North African and Arab Muslims in Muslim Spain also had to be paid in the following manner. The Christian, or as he's called here, the Dhimmi, would have to present the jizya money to the Muslim tax collector, who would be sitting on a throne high above the Christian. The Muslim would then grab the Christian by the throat and say, quote, "O Dhimmi, enemy of Allah, pay the jizya that you owe us for the protection and tolerance that we grant you." The other Muslims present would then push the Christian around to further humiliate the poor European, while also further cementing their own dominance over their Christian and Jewish subjects. Imagine how horrifying it must feel when you are on your way to pay an extortionist tax to foreigners in your own homeland, and knowing that you will also be physically assaulted in the process. But this hasn't stopped their own descendants from romanticizing said Muslim foreigners for academic acceptance in an increasingly ideological and dishonest field. Dhimmis were also not allowed to build houses that were taller than those of Muslims, forcing Spanish Christians who wanted to do so to either convert or to leave their ancestral homeland. Within the legal system of Al-Andalus, the testimony of a Jew or a Spanish Christian witness also always carried less weight than that of a Muslim, naturally resulting in many cases where Muslims would just accuse Spanish Christians of any crime if it benefited the Muslim accuser, since the Christian's testimony was valued less than that of the Muslim. The only way the Christian could counter this was either by bribing the Muslim judge, thus contributing to a culture of corruption within Al-Andalus, or alternatively live as far as possible away from any Muslim, which made Al-Andalus even more segregated. Ask yourself, did Muslim Spain really sound like the country that David Levering Lewis, 2 times Pulitzer Prize winner, and Julius Silver, professor of history at New York University, called religiously tolerant and maturing in cultural sophistication? I'm sadly not surprised that both of these people are well established within Western academia despite making these claims, but on the other hand, maybe I'm wrong and completely cherry picking, so let's focus on something even more basic, like protection from bodily harm. Surely Christians and Jews in Al-Andalus were treated as normal human beings who deserved basic protection. Sadly, for the Europeans who had survived up until this point in Muslim Spain, this presumption would be very wrong. If a Muslim happened to kill a Christian, then the only legal repercussion that Muslim could possibly face was to be told to pay a restitution fee to the Christian's family. That's it, no prison sentence or dramatic amputation, just a hefty fine, like if you, for example, today smashed someone's car up. This stands in stark contrast to the punishment for murdering another Muslim, which was capital punishment. It should, however, be noted here that some legal interpretations of Sunni Islam does not discriminate between the murder of a Christian and a Muslim, but in the case of the Maliki interpretation of Sunni Islam, which was the type of Islam practiced in Muslim Spain, this clear form of abhorrent discrimination is the norm. Dhimmis were therefore also, unlike Muslims, prohibited from owning weapons which could potentially be used to defend themselves against any potential Muslim aggressor. This historical reality that many Southern Europeans had to live with hasn't, however, stopped the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World from describing the Islamic rule over Spain as religiously tolerant. Hey, quickly, if you like how this video is made and you yourself is interested in having me edit your videos, I would more than love to do that. Just reach out to me on Instagram or Telegram. And secondly, if you wish to support this project in telling stories that no one else is talking about and exposing hypocrisies that the media isn't covering because it doesn't align with their own narrative, then consider supporting Postenebras on Patreon. It doesn't have to be for more than $3 a month, and with that you will be participating in making more videos from Postenebras possible. The link to Patreon is in the description. Christians and Jews were also, in accordance with their dhimmi status, prohibited from building any new churches or using the church's bells. This law, however, appears to have been only strictly enforced under some Islamic rulers, since some synagogues and churches were still occasionally built within Islamic Spain. So now, let's say that you as a Christian in Al-Andalus have demolished your 3rd floor, gotten beaten up and paid your protection money, managed not to get falsely accused by a Muslim, and finally managed not to just get straight up murdered without repercussions, then are you finally free to enjoy life in the vibrant, exciting, multicultural, and tolerant Islamic paradise that Al-Andalus so clearly was? No, after the Umayyad dynasty was overthrown by the Almorawid dynasty in around 1086, the Almorawids ordered the expulsion of many Christians to North Africa, and many other Christians in turn fled to the Catholic states in the north of Spain. In 1099, the Muslims also sacked the Great Church of Granada, and in 1126, the entire Christian population of the city was expelled to North Africa. Thanks to all these deportations, executions, and incredibly discriminatory laws, the Christian population would soon become a minority within Al-Andalus. Which presents a giant question: how could Al-Andalus be a multicultural melting pot when all the Christians kept getting kicked out of their cities? But according to two-time Pulitzer Prize winner David Livering Lewis, at least the peasants living in the villages of Muslim Spain were safe, unlike the peasants living in Europe who had to deal with constant warfare, right? Right? Well, no. While many degenerate, evil, and self-absorbed medieval Christian leaders certainly didn't mind wiping out entire peasant family trees in pointless personal wars against their own countrymen, the Muslims in Spain were in reality no different, and it's frankly astonishing that famous academics can be proven wrong with a quick Google search. You see, while Al-Andalus is often presented as one coherent state, this idea couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, Al-Andalus was run by local Muslim warlords ruling over many states called Taifas, meaning factions, much like dukes and counts would also autonomously run their own affairs in, for example, the Holy Roman Empire. And just like in the Holy Roman Empire, these Taifas would spend just as much time fighting each other over personal grudges and land as they would spend on fighting their Christian enemies. And this infighting naturally created a climate of insecurity for the average citizens of Muslim Spain. This heavy infighting was in fact so common that it would later prove to be instrumental in the downfall of Al-Andalus to the Spanish. And finally, let's talk about everyone's favorite lighthearted topic, slavery. In Islamic Spain, slavery, including a special type of slavery, was widely practiced and deeply ingrained within its society. While it was sometimes not allowed in Al-Andalus to take dhimmis as slaves, Christians kidnapped in raids both on sea and land were everywhere in Islamic Spain, and we will shortly talk about their many roles in this multicultural Islamic paradise. But before we talk about that, let's talk about which slaves were most highly prized. During the Umayyad period in the 10th century, an enslaved black girl was worth 300 dinars, while an enslaved blonde girl, either captured in raids or at times sold by European slavers to the Muslims, was worth more than 1,000 dinars. And according to another document from the 12th century, this resulted in many enslaved darker women being forced by the slavers to whiten their faces. So while politically motivated Western academics like to claim that Europeans were the ones to somehow invent racism, the medieval Muslim Arabs seem to clearly disagree. While many enslaved people who were at the mercy of the Muslim colonizers and Spanish converts were forced to do manual labor, be that anything from farming to turning their own churches into mosques, many enslaved European women suffered a much different fate. Within Muslim Spain, it was common for rich Muslim men to hold enslaved Christian and Jewish women captive and use them as slave concubines. A slave concubine being an enslaved person, usually a woman, who has to engage in sexual intercourse with their so-called owner. Abdul Rahman III, who was one of the most influential rulers of Muslim Spain and Portugal, for example, had 6,000 slave concubines in his harem. These harems have later on been romanticized by Western and Arab academics who describe them as palaces filled with food where beautiful women from around the world intermixed, but conveniently they brush over the fact that these women were there entirely against their own will and could not refused their Muslim masters. Imagine how sad these young women must have felt first having been taken from their loving families and then put into this position. But of course that hasn't stopped people from glorifying it. In fact, some genius academics have argued that the skills learned by the enslaved women, which were meant to please their so-called masters, promoted women's liberation. Personally, I'm unsure how kidnapping women and forcing them into a harem where they can exclusively learn skills that pleases their kidnapper has anything to do with women's liberation, but to be fair, I don't have a degree in women's studies, so that's probably beyond my academic comprehension. And to quickly touch on freedom of speech in Al-Andalus, well, it was non-existent, since any Muslim or Dhimmi who would say anything that the authorities would deem blasphemous would be executed in brutal fashion. Now, you probably remember that we previously talked about the Spanish holdout in Asturias in the north of Spain and the defeat of the Muslims at the Battle of Covadonga. Well, this battle became the turning point in the war between the Spanish Christians and the Muslim invaders, which had now entered a new phase called the Reconquista. The Reconquista was a 700-year-long bitter conflict that, as the name suggests, resulted in the Spanish people finally driving the colonizers across the Mediterranean and back into North Africa in the year 1491. Some Western scholars now decry this final defeat of the Muslim invaders as the end of the harmonious Islamic multicultural paradise that they called La Convivencia, meaning living together in Spanish. James L. Heft and Alton Brooker describes the so-called convivencia as a time where all three major Abrahamic religions lived together in close proximity without noticeable conflict. But this narrative, as we have seen, isn't correct, since many Christian populations were completely expelled from cities and others were forced into slavery either in the fields or in the harems, both of which I suppose you could call living in close proximity to the Muslims. So, in total, now that we have gone over all of these genuine and serious historical facts about the reality of life in Al-Andalus, do you still think that it was a harmonious golden age of tolerance where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived side by side and intermixed thanks to the light of Sharia and Islamic philosophers? Or have you alternatively come to the conclusion that Al-Andalus was just another oppressive feudal state that at best was just as horrible as the rest of the planet's larger organized societies at the time, or in fact much worse, since it was also a colonial state that constantly tried to expand further into southern Europe in an attempt to impose its strict social hierarchy upon its native population, in which Muslim Arabs would be at the top, followed by converts and native Christians at the bottom? Well, I'm going to let you decide that one for yourself. But this still leaves us with one final question. Why do academics and others try to romanticize Al-Andalus? Well, firstly, not all academics paint a rosy picture of Muslim Spain. People like Abdul Theodor Khoury, Roberto de Mattei, Alfred Morabia, and Sylvain Guggenheim have all published books that provide a far more critical perspective on Muslim Spain and its supposedly harmonious society, but all of them have curiously enough been unable to have their books printed by the universities. In Guggenheim's case, his works were considered so threatening to the educational establishment that 56 academics signed an open letter that was published in the French newspaper Libération attacking the book. His detractors naturally, more specifically, claimed that the book is, quote, a work of fear and hatred, and not to mention, quote, Islamophobic. So while scholars that approach this topic critically do exist, they are silenced by the academic establishment. The reason why these influential academics who have fancy degrees in Arabism and the study of Islamic culture and history try to silence critics and promote their beliefs about Muslim Spain can be explained in two parts. Firstly, because these academics are a part of a larger societal and academic movement that, to simplify slightly, believes that Europe is the root of all evil. Secondly, it is because publishing research and books that harshly criticize a part of Islamic history, which is by many Muslims seen as one of the greatest accomplishments of their civilization, will result in many grant-giving institutions and Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar pulling their funding from any universities that dares to do actual research. For reference, the oil-rich Arab country of Qatar has since 2011 given at least $1 billion to elite American universities, with Georgetown alone receiving $333 million. So it's pretty clear that it would be really bad for business to publish the type of information which is contained within this video if you want another grant from Qatar. Finally, I also want to say that while Al-Andalus certainly wasn't a paradise by any stretch of the imagination, it did genuinely have some nice influences on Spain. One certainly can't deny that the Islamic architecture left by the Muslims, which is now scattered around Spain, is absolutely beautiful, and Islamic understandings of hygiene were likely also more advanced than those of medieval Europeans. The Arabic musical influences are definitely also something that I can appreciate as a huge fan of Arab music. But at the end of the day, I think that the average medieval Spanish person would have been fine without these additions if it meant that he wouldn't have had to live as a dhimmi in Al-Andalus. Thank you so much for watching the video. Here are the different ways that you can help this video gain traction. First, like the video. Secondly, give it a nice comment. Thirdly, share the videos on forums, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And lastly, the absolutely only way that Postenebros can continue is if you support it on Patreon, since this is what the vast majority of my time gets spent on, and therefore it won't be possible to make these videos without your support. On Patreon, you can support Postenebros with as little as $3 a month, or any larger amount as well. If you support Postenebros on Patreon, you are not only making the continuation of Postenebros possible, you will also receive a lot of early access footage and behind the scenes stuff, and naturally you will also be given a shout out at the end of every video for your amazing help. The link to Patreon can be found in the video's description. The current patrons who are making these videos possible are Justin, Enrico, Alexander, Luke, Laurentius, Milan, Joda, Jean, and William. Thank you all.